Uh, so everyone, welcome to the seminar, to the webinar today. Let's see, we're a couple of minutes past, so I think we're gonna, and there's so much to cover today. So unless, Ben, you feel differently, I'm just gonna start moving and shaking and moving things around here a little bit. So welcome to this very exciting webinar, our April webinar, and our 6th one, I think, right, that we're doing. Today we have lawyered up for Governance Day. We're very excited to have Markus Wagner here. He is associate professor at the University of Wollongong, which I probably isn't pronounced anything like that, but you can look it up in his LinkedIn profile. And he is an academic globetrotter, and he so you might have been able to catch him before. He's also, for you lawyers out there, he's also the who know about SEAL, the Society of International Economic Law. He's the current director there. And then we have Penelope writing, who the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs has dubbed one of New Zealand's most distinguished international lawyers. She has been an ambassador, the High Commissioner. I don't know if there's such a thing as a low commissioner, but she's been the high one, and chief legal advisor. And now she is. Oh, I'm gonna botch this one up, Penny. The arbitrary thing at the WTO thing.
Just follow the MPIA.
Lokni is there too. She's in Singapore, so your colleague there. So thank you. And so she's actually very hard to get to listen into, because she's usually not in a place to speak openly like this. And so she has been smack dab in the middle of the action, and she has been negotiating both the P4, which then led into TPP, CPTPP, and then ASEAN, and all sorts of things. So that's our speakers for today. To open up with that, welcome to the forum, which Ben and I set up back in October. Our goal is to bridge the gap between different research disciplines, which we're doing today specifically for us, me, who are just an economist. Ben and Penny are both. And so the gap is bigger for me. And so also we're bridging that gap between research and policy, and between policy implementers and practitioners. So that's the forum. My name is Hannah Norberg. For you who haven't met me before, I'm the trade economist, and I also have the honor of running the Trade Experts. And Ben, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? You do that better.
Sure, thanks, Hannah. Welcome, everyone. So Ben Shepherd is my name. I'm at Developing Trade Consultants in New York, and very happy to be here for this this special webinar today. A bit of a change of pace from the previous ones, and really looking forward to it.
Excellent. So the concept is a 1-hour webinar, sort of a brown bag, bringing the best speakers to the comfort of your own home. We will have Penny, Markus presenting first. We're going to try out a little different based on all the work that we have been doing online, and Markus has been working with CL to work on their conference. So we were talking about what the best way to do this is, and so might change it up a little bit than we'll usually do. A little shorter presentations and a lot more talk action afterwards, because there's so much to discuss today. So Markus is going to have about 15 minutes, I think, to introduce the subject, and he's going to jump in for about 10 minutes. Please join us in the discussion. This is the forum. It's only going to be as awesome as the people who join in and who jump on this train. So please keep the conversation going in the chat box as we go. I think that about covers it. I was seeing if Mia is not on here yet, nor is Javier, because they were looking for, they had job openings, but they are on Twitter and on LinkedIn. We are on Twitter and LinkedIn. We have a group on LinkedIn. If you're not in there yet, just ask to join. Please join us also on Twitter. There's a lot of conversation going on there afterwards. And we have our brand new blog out from the last webinar. Mia wrote a blog, and Markus has one coming up, so that's also new for the forum. Enough said. Let's boogie. Take it, Markus.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Hannah. I'm going to actually start to do a PowerPoint, which I sometimes sometimes feel like I shouldn't do, but I feel in some sense it made more sense. So let me first say thanks very much for having me and for inviting me. There's a sealed webinar going on at the very same time, which we need to plan better next time, right, on COVID and distribution. Let me just say I'm aware that having a lawyer at the trade policy forum is not the standard MO, and I'm very grateful to be invited here. Having had a look at the participant list, I actually recognize a whole bunch of names, some of whom are actually my former students, and somehow they seem to not having been able to get enough of me. And they're all doing great things at this point. I feel a little bit like I'm in lion's den, hopefully make it out alive amongst the economists. But my own take is that we do need more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work anyway. And I think, Hannah, yours and Ben's invitation was in that vein, right? That we need to talk across disciplinary boundaries. So what I'm trying to do in this paper, that's the basis for my remarks, is to analyze the more recent approaches to international economic governance. And the way I'm trying to do this, and this is a very brief overview, is different governance models that we see more recently outside of the European context. How do certain arrangements / agreements stack up? And I'm looking at the CPTPP, the RCEP, and the BRI. And then I'll give a brief outlook at the very end. The reason why I think why I'm interested in trying to come up with somewhat of a new model for determining characteristics of international economic governance is because the EU is singular in its form and its substance, right? And measuring the EU or trade arrangements or trade agreements along that model isn't particularly helpful. They're mostly built on the EU, but it is sort of sui generis. And I know, Penny, you don't like that term particularly, but I'll use it anyway, because I do think the EU in that sense is sui generis. It is a particular form of integration, much more intense integration than anywhere else. So what I propose then is to look at a number of elements, which I'll get to in a second, and apply that model to these three arrangements that I've outlined. And I'll focus mostly on the model. We'll have to remain on a bird's eye view regarding the content of the treaties, not only because I don't have the time to go into all of them, but also Hannah said, don't be the typical lawyer and go into every little gritty detail, which is fine with me, right? So let me get started then. We know that the number of existing preferential trade agreements has risen dramatically. Not everything is new, but I think there's important distinctions for present purposes that really lies in how these elements change the qualitative character of an agreement or an arrangement from what used to be really just market access to much closer integration and to what we'll see in a little bit, sort of block building. And the way I conceived of this in this paper is by looking at various elements, namely the subject matter coverage of these different agreements / arrangements, the regulatory, some form of regulatory coherence, institutional arrangements. There is some overlap between these two, standard setting and dispute settlement. I'll go through all of these in the model, but basically sort of say, first and foremost, the traditional issues, goods, services, IP, we see a significant expansion from that. E-commerce on substance, for example, procedurally, we see much more regulatory coherence chapters, and we see some institutional innovations as well. With respect to regulatory coherence, what we see there is really this move away from tariffs to non-tariff barriers as a next step towards greater integration. I'll bypass the whole history of the concept. I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A. There's some sort of uncertainty over what it means, but the way I would define it is the alignment of procedural requirements that may lead to de facto behind the border barriers to international trade. And these third or fourth generation barriers to trade can have considerable trade distorting effects. Think of, for example, tobacco control, animal welfare, energy production, all cases that we've seen in policy discussions that we've seen come up. And it's important because this elimination of these regulatory barriers is intended to lead to greater compatibility of regulatory systems. And then the question, of course, is which model do you follow? And we see different models of regulatory systems competing with one another at this particular moment in time. The idea behind that is really designed to increase transparency in governmental decision-making. And some of the elements that we usually see is transparency, public consultation, impact analysis, coordination among different actors that are involved in the regulation or in the regulatory process. Then we see institutional arrangements for regulatory cooperation, and that oftentimes takes then place through periodic meetings of government officials. Exchange of information, notifications, harmonization, policy coordination, preemption of disputes. As a lawyer, I would always say these are also mechanisms to preempt disputes from ever getting to become actual legal disputes. And we've seen some of these elements in the WTO, especially in the SPS and TPT context beforehand. But the newer preferential trade agreements go considerably further. There's a qualitatively different role for these arrangements. In the what I would now call comatose, maybe again comatose, TTIP, we see, for example, an entire regulatory, horizontal regulatory coherence chapter, in addition to lots of regulatory coherence elements in the individual chapters, which makes a TTIP a living instrument. And I think Penny will go into this in a little bit later on. We may have a discussion about that. Of course, that has the potential to curtail regulatory autonomy. Power disparity is a problem, and a potential lack of transparency. I'm happy to go into a discussion later on. Then the use of or development of international standards, and I think this is really where the rub lies at the moment. There's usually sort of two sides to this. They allow for easier circulation of products within countries that adhere to these standards, of course, but prevent products that don't meet these requirements from entering the market and become competitors. And I'm German enough to use Siemens here, right? He who owns the standard owns the market. And to some extent, I think that's true. And so standards, of course, we know are not de jure binding. Happy to go into details again, but most international standards, or some international standards, are de facto binding. The Brussels effect, as we all know, and so forth, right? Then there's binding dispute settlement. I'm still lawyer enough to at least throw that in. And there's different versions of dispute settlement that I would call either no dispute settlement mechanism, at least for lawyers' purposes, not because they don't make much money out of it, but because it's a political dispute settlement process, right? That takes place in sort of committees, or a referral to an adjudicator, but that is, for example, subject to vetoes by a party. Then you have these quasi-judicial models that provide an automatic right to adjudication, independent third parties, but panels are oftentimes composed on an ad hoc basis. And then you have these, what I would call really judicial models that are characterized by a greater degree of independence, permanency of the membership of the dispute settlement organs. And what we see here, I hope this is not too small, but I'll make the slide available later on, is the number of agreements. And what you clearly see, there's virtually none that adhere to this judicial model, but the large majority now is this quasi-judicial model of dispute settlement. And then what I'm trying to do in the end is to map this on in a hopefully somewhat interdisciplinary fashion onto a graph that I've tried to come up with, and I'm happy to be told that all of this is wrong and that I need to rethink all of this, right? But at least Ben was intrigued enough by one slide that I put up to invite me here, so you can blame Ben for that particular, if you think this is a waste of time, right? So then I apply this throughout the CPTPP, the RCEP and the BRI. And I won't spend much time on this because I think we're running almost short on time already. But what you do see is that at least the way that I conceived of this, and we can quibble where the exact dots need to be for each of these. But by and large, I would argue that the CPTPP, at least between these three agreements/arrangements, is relatively highly developed, right? If you compare that, for example, and I'm happy to go into this in greater detail, if you compare that to the RCEP, which has a somewhat overlapping, but not entirely overlapping membership, with of course China being in RCEP but not the CPTPP, and very much driven by ASEAN. If you look at that, it's much less developed, right? The coverage is relatively wide, but regulatory coherence is almost non-existent. Standards are non-existent. Dispute settlement, I sort of put in the middle, because with ASEAN, you sort of never know. I mean, Penny has ideas about this, but ASEAN really has, at least in the past, very much put an emphasis on political dispute settlement and not judicial dispute settlement. We can talk about what that means, right, and why that is important. Now, the BRI, I put this sort of tongue-in-cheek, right? There's literally nothing in the BRI as a concept, and I have to say a little bit more about this, of course. Why include the BRI is a question that I get asked. It's a project of the century, according to Xi Jinping in 2017. It is incredibly ambitious, of course, and it's clearly not the same as an RCEP or a CPTPP. But for purposes of trade governance in the future, I think I would argue that the blueprint for what China wants to achieve is laid out not so much in its trade agreements, but rather in the BRI, even with respect to trade, right? The coverage is virtually non-existent, of course, and regulatory coherence is not there. I actually put that dot, I'm just realizing this, in the wrong place. It should be in the standards column. I apologize for that. I'll make sure I'll get that right. There's dispute settlement, it's there, but it's not a dispute settlement between countries, but rather between investors or between corporations or private parties and China itself, right? So what you see that is, this one is in the right spot, thankfully, is an entirely different model of trade integration and trade governance that underlies the BRI vis-a-vis RCEP and vis-a-vis the CPTPP. Again, I could go into great detail in all of this, but in the interest of time, I'll just try to get to the end now. I think if you look at this, number one, the BRI is an ill fit with existing trade agreements, and that's why I call it an arrangement rather than an agreement. I would call it sui generis again, but on the completely different end of the spectrum from the EU, right? Highly integrative on the EU side, but also singular. And the BRI, not very integrative at all, but also fairly singular in the way that it's conceived. The ambition, however, is vast, and the implications, I think, for international trade governance are considerable. Unlike other agreements, the BRI centers around China, with little chance for other governments to make an imprint on the structural design of the arrangement, right? One commentator, I think, put it quite nicely when he said, China sets up the room, the framework, while all its partners may be invited to work together to design the interior details, right? So the room's already there, and maybe you can change the wallpaper, but that's all you get to do, right? That's all you get to do. My argument is that China has created a de facto rather than a de jure economic integration mechanisms on its terms, and you can't really change the terms. There's nothing, there's virtually no sort of arrangement that you can change. There's almost no discussion material to be taken. At first blush, you may think this is innocuous because legal obligations are few and far between. But as a lawyer, at least, I'm concerned that law is there for the less powerful, right? It's supposed to be a protective hedge. But if you take all of that away, then the protective hedge isn't there anymore. I realize that that may come as a surprise to some of you, but I think that's the way that I would conceive of law in this respect. And in the end, I think it's designed, the BRI is designed in such a manner that China's financial, economic, political interests prevail in situations of serious disagreement. And you can see this, for example, by way of dispute settlement. It's simply not there. All disputes are supposed to be settled amicably by way of political means, not by way of any kind of independent, impartial third party that then adjudicates any kind of trade disputes that may arise. And the courts that are set up for the BRI are Chinese courts, right? They're really, they resemble commercial arbitration courts and not traditional interstate or intergovernmental trade courts in any way, shape, or form. So count me a little bit among the skeptics on that, but not in the way that I usually see the debate around the BRI evolving, right? Or it's either fully for or fully against. What I'm trying to do is to simply say here, let's come up with some elements or some characteristics according to which we can actually evaluate it, right? And so not as to be completely subjective. And my own take is that literature on the BRI is very sort of binary. It's you're either for it or you're against it. And I'm happy to sort of stand in the middle and get the mud from both sides, if you will. But I do think that having some characteristics upon which one can measure the arrangement is better than just saying this is what it is in my mind, right? And I'm happy to go into a discussion later on whether these are the right characteristics or not. So let me come to the end. I say futures of international economic governance for a reason. I don't think there is one future. I think we're at an inflection point where we will see somewhat of a balkanization of international trade governance. The WTO will still be there. We do have a new DG, but and we will at some point, I think, I'm fairly hopeful, have a new or revised version of the appellate body. But we will see other forums come to the fore. My own take is that the EU and the BRI are, like I said, polar opposites. They're a genus of one, right? They're not any kind of model, but we can see tensions between these more highly integrative models and the BRI. The US has been critical for a long time. The EU has characterized China as a systemic rival, hinting, among other initiatives, at the BRI as promoting alternative models of governance. Look, these governance models themselves have political implications. The US is open about this, for example, when it described the TPP at the time, it was still in negotiation phases, as setting high standard trade rules and providing ambitious liberalization of trade and investment, and implicitly as a counterpoint to China's growing influence in the Asia Pacific. The TTIP at the time was also similarly conceived of as strategic. Karel de Gucht was very clear about this because he said, we want to reinforce the standard setting put forth by the EU and the US. So what we see, I think, is a competition for rulemaking initiatives in international economic relations. We see a competition for standard setting for 21st century international economic governance. And we see this even more so in today's world where the visions for international economic governance are drifting further and further apart. I think what we see is an uncertain and unsettled future over the shaping of globalization. In some weird way, I think that international economic relations have had so far escaped the jockeying for strategic competition, that for at least some time after 1990, but we see this coming full force at the moment. Global and multilateral institutions have been replaced, at least for the time being, with arrangements of a preferential nature. Or supplemented, if you will, and those bring with them explicit and implicit values that I'm trying to lay bare in the article. Now, Hannah, you asked me to end with the one thing to take away from a presentation, right? And I've done some soul searching about this, and some of you may think this is not particularly trenchant. But one thing that's becoming increasingly important, more so than before, I think, is the role of standards in international economic governance. I haven't spent much time on it so far, but I'm happy to go into some more details in the Q&A. If you look at the standard setting that's going on, for example, in the BRI, it is a very different form of standard setting that that is being done there. And I've started thinking about how standard setting, for example, in the digital economy, will entrench particular standards. Right? We see this in DEPA, we see this in Singapore, Australia. I promised that I would put the DEPA in at some point, and I think you can actually see that there. Right? I would suggest that we're already witnessing a siloing or balkanizing of the internet, and that will continue in the future. And the increasing role of digital trade and the extension of, say, digital currency into global value chains or blockchains into healthcare will allow certain actors to play the role of gatekeeper. And in my mind, at least, and I hope no one takes that and writes an article about this before I do, this type of standard setting in, say, the digital trade, digital currency, blockchain will allow sort of a permanent X-raying of the global value chain. Right? So if you supply that, it allows you to look very deeply into these elements. Again, I think China can be expected to play a fairly leading role, and I think is using the BRI to set these standards. So let me leave it there. And if you want to get in touch with me, this is the way to do it. And look forward to a discussion later on.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation, Markus. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for getting up in the middle of the night. And thank you for actually searching your soul for the message for policymakers.
I mean, right? As a German, I have one. It's hard to believe.
Above and beyond, really. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Penny, I'm just going to hand it right over.
Well, I want to first thank Hannah and Ben for actually having me on. It's really, really nice. And also to Markus too, for your excellent presentation. I want to say what my perspective is. So I'm coming from the perspective of an FTA negotiator. So, but when you're doing the negotiations, you get all involved in the nitty gritty. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to try to do is actually take a bird's eye view and look more at sort of the governance frameworks. So my takeaway from Markus's presentation is there's a whole changing nature of FTAs in the future, and this has important implications for standard setting. I want to actually cover 4 different sorts of issues. So the first is addressing behind the border issues as a way in which to enhance economic integration. The second is the role of living arrangements to further economic integration. And then the value of what I call springboard agreements to do the same thing. And then the value, taking an even bigger, broader perspective, the notion of community as an indicator of economic integration. So first, the behind the border constraints to trade. This is really, as Markus has pointed out, the real difference between some of the older FTAs and then the newer ones, particularly CPTPP. Markus has already covered all of this, so I'm not actually going to go in any depth because I think we all understand this and we all see this happening. So I want to actually go on to the issue of the living arrangements as furthering economic integration. So like Markus, I want to look at the Belts and Road Initiative. I totally agree with Markus that it is an amorphous set of arrangements. It's based very much on political arrangements and private arrangements. And it's really based upon building partnerships between China and other countries. When you think about that 60% of the world's population are covered by the BRI, this is a large initiative. And now it's more than just simply, it started off as more sort of a multifaceted infrastructure type project and more for aid for trade. But now it's moving into other areas, health in particular, and also education. So it really is part of a living arrangement, and it will develop and change with time. And so that's I think that's an interesting part of the BRI. But like Markus, I think you've also got to remember that there is often a twinning arrangement not only a BRI initiative, but also China has FTAs with a number of different countries as well. So it's sort of like a twinning with the traditional type of FTA as well as the new BRI type initiatives as well. So I think that in general, I certainly support sort of the flexible, adaptive mechanisms that can respond to new policy developments. And that's what I call living arrangements. We can talk more about other types of living arrangements and the issue that Markus raised as to whether the institutional mechanisms from these living arrangements, which allow sort of interpretations, allow new developments to take place, whether there's a democratic deficit as a result of that. So we can come back to that. So my third thing, which I think is very important, is the value of springboard agreements. So the best example I have of a springboard agreement, and these springboard agreements can be a way in which you can develop your increased integration, not only within yourselves, but also with others. So the example I have is the one you mentioned in the introduction, Hannah, which is the P4. Now the P4 started off as the P3 between New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile, and then Brunei came on board, and then it became the P4. One of the reasons why it was called the P3 initially is because in the first round, there was no agreement on, we were trying to decide what to call it. So it ended up by being the P3 for the, and then after a lot of discussion, we ended up by calling it the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership. So there was a long word for it, but it was very important for all three countries, New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile in particular, to use the word strategic, because we were seeing that this was an agreement which potentially crossed Asia, New Zealand, and then off to Latin America. So it was very much seen as a bridge. And it was conceived as a way in which to actually draw in other countries from the Asia Pacific region, and hence why there was a push to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership morphed into the CPTPP. So this was an example of how an initial agreement can actually then expand out and can be used as a springboard to another agreement. RCEP is exactly the same, because of course RCEP started off with the ASEAN, and then there was various bilateral FTAs between various RCEP partners, and then because it was negotiated for 8 years, so it was a long period, and so bilateral FTAs were negotiated, and then in the case of ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand, there was we call it the ANSFTA, which is the Australia-New Zealand ASEAN agreement. And that was also used as a springboard. And the whole point of this is that in each new iteration of a new FTA, there was a deeper integration. There was more trade preferences. There was more trying to get back to the behind the border issues. There was better coherence. So all of these were actually, in advance. So I see that these springboard agreements are actually really, really important way to develop economic integration, and can progressively lead to more ambitious FTAs. Now, the fourth point I want to make is I want to take a bigger, broader perspective. And this is where I sort of bring in a bit of international organizations theory, in the sense that international governance really comes down to a question of community versus a single purpose or purposeful organization. So where there is a greater sense of community between the members, there's actually a better sense of being able to integrate more. And in some cases, FTAs may be single purpose, basically just designed to increase trade liberalization between the partners. But there are other cases where the community of members mean that it can address problems and new problems as they arise. The EU, of course, is the biggest and most well-known example of this, but I would also, there's others as well. Between New Zealand and Australia, the Closer Economic Relations, the CER, which was developed in 1983, and that has really, it's now there's working towards developing a single economic market. I mean, it's really, in terms of a sui generis process, it really is a sui generis process to actually have, you know, a community of interest between two countries which are very, very close. There's others too, Mercosur, but I would also here add the digital economy partnership agreement, the DEPA. So I also promised I would mention DEPA. What I find interesting about DEPA is, of course, is that it starts with the 3 countries which started a P3. So Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. And you might think, well, there's no sense of community between those 3 countries. But because they're very, very different in cultural and geographical areas, and normally a community is, you know, you've got some sort of similarity. But what I find really interesting is that they all have the same kind of approach to trade liberalization. They also all have the same pragmatic approach to negotiations, and also all have the same innovative approach to try to problem solve and find different ways of dealing with issues. So in a way, they have their own community of 3, and then now they're trying to use the DEPA as a springboard by bringing in more countries. And so that will be, you know, potential both for community, but also as a springboard to more countries coming in to addressing the digital economy. So in my view, the more that an organization represents a community, and the more flexible it is, the more adaptive it is, then the more it will be able to change and adapt and to address new problems as they come through. So I think that having a sense of community is a good indicator. When you don't have a sense of community any longer, you get exit, or in the case of the EU, you get Brexit. So I think that community is actually a really useful indicator to think of as well. So my takeaway from all of this is that the changing natures of FTA demonstrates that there is greater economic integration in the future, and that will come through new approaches and to FTAs and new approaches to addressing some of these significant issues that we've got coming through. And I think the trend is to having more living arrangements, to using existing agreements as springboards, and to having more agreements which have a sense of community, which is driving them. So that's my comments, but I'm very happy to answer any questions as well and have a good discussion with Markus.
That was a great bird's eye view, Penny, something that even I understood, even though this was my first rodeo in this area. Actually, the questions are coming in. So Markus, you want to go first? Do you want to comment on something that Penny said, or should we leave it to Ben to start with the questions? What do you think? You're on mute. It's a classic.
Completely up to you. I'm in your hands. I have something to say, but Ben, take it away. Doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, let's leave it to Ben.
Sure, always happy to jump in. So thanks to both of you for the really interesting presentation and comments. As you've seen, there are a number of questions both in the chat and also in the Q&A. You know, let me take up one that's sort of come in twice, actually 3 times in different ways, and it's a 2-part question. You know, the first part is, you know, Markus, can you tell us a little bit more about the methodology that you use to produce those matrices? So, you know, I think it's a very intuitive way of talking about those agreements, you know, so it made a lot of sense to me, having sometimes looked at these things from a completely different angle. But just to know a little bit more about sort of what process went into that and how you came up with the measurement. So that's part one of the question. Then part two of the question, I think building on Gianni's question in the chat, is, you know, presumably we can take this methodology and apply it to different sets of agreements. So, you know, you focus on the Asia Pacific for obvious reasons, but we could equally take it to Africa. We could take it to other parts of the world and do the same thing. So if you could maybe just sort of speak to those two issues a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, so let me maybe pick up the latter first. The idea is actually to use this in other agreements, right? It actually takes quite a bit of time to trawl through each agreement and sort of pick out the bits and bobs, and that leads me in a second to the first question, right? But I just simply, the piece is already 15,000 words at this point. There's almost no law journal that takes this, except US student-run journals, and I didn't want this to be in a student-run journal. At which point you then have to go into like 25 to like 35,000 words, and I didn't want to write that long either, right? So I wanted to pick agreements / arrangements, and I use that term advisedly, right? Because I believe, look, I'm completely with Gianni. We may part ways in another place, but I'm with Gianni to say that the BRI is not a trade agreement in the traditional mold, but it has huge implications for trade governance nevertheless, right? So I don't conceive of it only as an investment arrangement. I think it has considerable trade implications as well, and that's what the paper is limited to. But I'm happy to talk about Andrea's question in the Q&A at some point that does address investment law. And so that then comes back to the question of how do I classify, right? And the classification, I don't believe that you can take legal texts and then give a numerical value to them. I know that there's colleagues of mine that do that, and I salute them for that. I don't think that, for example, in the dispute settlement chapters, you can necessarily do that, right? We'll also have to see how this actually plays out in law in action, because let's be realistic. Most dispute settlement chapters in preferential trade agreements have never been used, right? They've never been used. We've seen the WTO being the locus of that. We see some action in under NAFTA previously. We certainly see the European Union, but again, I would leave that out. You see some dispute settlement in the Andean community and in various parts, but by and large, they haven't been active. What I was looking at is different gradations, for example, in that particular space of how judicialized are they, as opposed to a political dispute settlement model that, for example, ASEAN countries have traditionally been favoring. And then, like I said, you can quibble with me over exactly where the dot is, but I take that liberty as a non-economist to not do this in a hard empirical fashion, because I just don't think that is particularly useful. It's partially a value judgment. If someone wants to accuse me of that, I'm guilty as charged, to use that metaphor. But what I'm trying to do is to give an impression, at least, of what the potential for the agreements is and how they're designed to function, right? Whether they will then function in reality as such, we'll have to see, because there's literally no track record, right? The CPTPP hasn't been around for all that long, which is why I'm not quite sure that we can make empirical statements about it. The same is true for RCEP, which is literally just come into play. So the evaluation is of the legal framework, and I'm coming from the law side, but I'm trying to say, what are the implications of those frameworks?
Yeah, that's a great response, because it gives me about half a dozen other questions. So let me sort of go on with a couple. I mean, you'll have seen from the logo that we have from the forum that we're about building bridges, right? So, you know, let me try and sort of build a bridge to the economics literature here. And I'm taking a bit of inspiration from Dan's question in the Q&A, and also a little bit from Inu's. But I'm not sure if you've seen, but the World Bank has very recently put out the exact sort of product that you were kind of talking about there, that you didn't want to do, which is a set of ones and zeros to describe the content of deep trade agreements. So for economists in the audience, it's a fun data set to play with. But you know, the interesting thing to me, and I think where the bridge comes in, is that, you know, economists, when we've talked about trade agreements, have always focused on market access. It's always been about tariff reductions and liberalisation and all that sort of stuff. But there's a real trend in the literature now to try and look more at these structural issues, which are, I think, the issues that you're focusing on. I'm just wondering, though, if we need to kind of bring these two things together a little bit. So, you know, when I saw the matrix there, I thought, aha, do we need another box on the end to talk about effective market access? And the reason why I'm asking the question is that I did some work on CETA for the UK government. So I was part of a sort of a Brexit scenario analysis. And I was working with a team of young lawyers, and they went through and they coded every bit of the agreement into an OECD Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. And what we found, to our shock, was that CETA, which is a high quality trade agreement between two service economies, had almost no liberalisation in services. It was basically just MFN treatment. And in some cases, it was even less liberal than MFN. So I just wonder how we balance those sorts of things together. So, you know, what do we say about an agreement that has, you know, a really progressive kind of structure and a lot of these structural elements that you're talking about, but doesn't do anything on market access? How do we conceptualize that?
God, how much time do we have left? And I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but let me just say this. I mean, I'm really grateful that you invited me for this, because I actually think having that discussion of, can we bridge that gap between, say, the doing business in reports that the World Bank did, which I'm a comparativist lawyer as well, right? When I saw the doing business in, I was horrified by this stuff, right? Because it was, I'm sorry to say this in this forum, right? But it was clearly done by economists who didn't want to engage with the legal culture in particular places, right? And sort of use one matrix and then basically look at every legal system and come up with the idea that the common law system must be better than the civil law system for some strange reason, right? And I'm too much of a law, I'm not a hardcore law and context person, but I'm also not a German black letter law person, right? So like somewhere in the middle, the truth is in the middle. So look, if an economist wants to sit down with me and we write a paper together about certain agreements, I think that would be some of the most useful things we could do, because you would then bring in two languages and two different types of assumptions together, and I think come to a better understanding of what these agreements are actually about, right? And I'm happy to extend methodologies. I'm not stuck with what I've tried to create here. Just to pick up something that Lockney said in the chat, I did look at trade and at labor and environmental issues. So they're in the paper actually, right? So under the heading of standards, I felt that they were needed in there. So I do talk about that. So when the paper hopefully comes out at some point in the future, you'll see that. But Lockney and I am happy to send the draft to her as well.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just say, you know, Dan has put I think a really helpful reference there in the chat, and so I mean it's true that CETA binds what would normally be applied policy. So when I'm talking about it just being MFN treatment, I mean applied MFN treatment, not bound MFN treatment. So I don't think there's any sort of conflict there, but that's a nice reference for those who are interested in knowing more. Hannah, maybe I can throw over to you. I'm sure you've got some questions as well. You're muted.
Classic.
Yeah.
Classic. I did it. Well, I have this one question that I always walk around with in these forums, right? That I would like both Penny and Markus to answer, and that is, so where you're coming from. So right where the things that you're learning from your deep dives into this, what do you think is the most important takeaway for policy use, for policymakers who are here and who don't have time to dive into this? What's your policy takeaways that you want people to remember from this seminar? So why don't we let Penny go first?
You always pose the really difficult questions, Hannah, don't you? I think that the thing that I would take away, what I would ask others to take away, is the importance of actually not being bound by strictures of what a typical FTA looks like, and what a typical kind of thing, typical economic integration should be. What I think is extremely important for people to appreciate is that it's important to be innovative, look outside the box. Don't just simply categorize into particular FTAs, just look broader. And so where there's a problem, look at a solution. And so that will be a way forward. And it doesn't really matter if you can't get everything all at once. I mean, look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And that's a classic example where, you know, the phases, you got phase 1, which is now implemented, and you got phase 2 coming, you know, so from a policy perspective, don't try to do everything all at once. Just try to do what you can and then let it grow. And so that would be my most important takeaway that I would suggest.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And for the AFCFTA, right? So there's some countries are stage 2, some countries haven't even ratified it yet, but don't let that stop you. Just put one foot in front of the other, right? So that's a really good pragmatic view, and you are one of the most creative and pragmatic people I know, Penny. So I can imagine. Markus, what's your take on that?
So I mean, when Penny, we had a conversation beforehand a week or two ago, right? And I admire pragmatism, but maybe I'm too German of a lawyer to not say something about this, right? And I would just ask, does pragmatism itself have costs, right? And I think if you look at, for example, the BRI, it is extremely pragmatic, right? You can't tie the Goliath down anywhere. As a lawyer who comes from the public law side, I want powerful players to be tied down somewhere, right? And tied to certain requirements. And that's one thing where I'm maybe a little bit more skeptical. And Penny has a wealth of experience that I don't have in that space, but count me more on the skeptical side on that front. Now, if you ask me what are the takeaways, one I've already said, the standard setting, I think that is going to be important. The other one is that I think we're moving more towards sort of a balkanization of trade governance. I don't think it's this happy kumbaya moment of 1995, which I always sort of say, like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we all held hands and sang kumbaya, and there was what the German Minister for Foreign Affairs said was global domestic politics. Hannah, clearly in pajamas and kumbaya moment is something, but we're not there anymore, right? I think we see a balkanization of the models. And that, I think, worries me in some sense, because I think that will then potentially, maybe I'm too skeptical about this, but potentially lead to greater rifts than we feel comfortable with in the long run.
Ben, I'm gonna ask you, there's like 2 more minutes and you can ask one more question or wrap up everyone, all the questions that we have, if you can wrap them up in one and get a really quick, fast.
Well, I mean, first to comment, as a Southern Hemisphere person myself, I think I've just learned that kumbaya moment is one of our expressions, because in Sweden, it doesn't seem to be quite as common. So that's something I didn't know before this morning. But no, look, I think maybe just to wrap it up, I mean, I really take a lot away from the 2 presentations, so both Markus's presentation and Penny's comments, and I think, it's really helpful for us as economists to sort of have a different way of looking at the process of economic integration and to have this idea of a continuum between all sorts of different mechanisms. And, as you were speaking, the one that I thought of a lot, and of course this is largely personal bias because I've done a bunch of work on it, but I also thought a lot about APEC because, we had this idea of sort of EU and BRI as opposite ends of the spectrum. But, APEC, when it was being designed, it was pretty explicitly to be the opposite of the EU on every dimension that they could figure out. And so I think, for people in the audience who are thinking, what's a good example to take some of this work further and to sort of think about how and I liked Penny's reference here to sort of something being flexible, adaptive, and sort of a way of living with each other. And I think, you know, APEC, for all its faults, and you know, there are numerous faults, I think that's something that it does pretty well. And when you get up close and personal with it, there is this kind of detailed exchange between regulators at a very technical level that I think gets to some of the regulatory cooperation and coherence questions that Markus was talking about. So, you know, what I see out of this is what I see out of every really good research presentation, which is some answers to questions that we were interested in, but then of course a whole bunch more questions that people can then take and run with and do more with. So I think it's been really useful from that perspective. So thank you very much to you both again for doing this late at night / early in the morning your time. And I'll just wrap up by putting up our slide for the next session. So we're going to be welcoming Christian Volpe Martinkus from IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, with discussing comments by Andrea Lastman from the University of Mainz. And we'll be talking about trade promotion and firm exports, looking beyond direct effects. So it's more of an economics presentation, but as we always try to do in these webinars, it's not going to be people kind of writing equations on blackboards and doing all that sort of stuff. It's going to be policy focused and trying to get a sense of what works in the export promotion space, and to try and learn something a little bit more about the mechanisms that lie behind it. So thanks to our presenters for being with us today. I think that was really a fantastic session. I think we did, you know, start the construction of some bridges there, which makes me very, very happy. Thanks to our audience for being with us. I think there were some great questions in Q&A and in chat, so we really do appreciate all of that. And please do join us for future webinars. So the next one, as you can see there, is on April 22nd. We aim to do about one a month. So please do keep an eye out. If you're interested, you can sign up for our mailing list via the website, or you can see us, as Hannah was saying at the outset, on LinkedIn and Twitter. That's all from me. Hannah, I don't know if you've got anything you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, just a couple of things for those who really enjoyed this seminar and who want an encore. We will be posting this recording on the website together with Markus' presentation. And there's also, so all the old ones are in there. And there are also blogs coming on this one. So check out the new blogs. And just again, to reiterate how important Twitter is, Craig Atkinson was on Twitter this morning, asked if we could cover RCEP, and that's how that came on the agenda. So it's a very powerful tool. Other than that, I just want to say thank you to everyone in the audience who has again lifted the level here of discussions, and to Penny and Markus for sharing all their expertise with us and getting up in the middle of the night. So thank you very much. And do go on Twitter and on LinkedIn, because I actually made a poster for next seminar, which Ben hasn't put up here, although I worked really hard in getting out all the typos that I first got in there, but that I then got out. So thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Excellent.